Good morning. You're on the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen, Fresh FM, reporting from the beautiful Nelson. In fact, I'm sitting down here this morning recording this show, again looking out towards Tahuna and the beautiful mountains, and it's quite peaceful and tranquil. And I just keep thinking every time I see this about events that are happening in the world at the moment. And, you know, what disturbs me is that we really have come to a point where we have a media that's actually not fit for telling complicated stories and not telling them without an agenda. Now, the frustration of what's been going on or what's happening in the Ukraine has been just gnawing away at me all the last 2-3 weeks. And the first thing, of course, is the fact that there is no mistaking the situation in terms of good old Vladimir Putin pulled his gun out in the wild, wild west and fired first. And from that viewpoint onwards, he's the bad guy. And he is a bad guy. And I saw a piece recently where he had a yacht that's worth $700 million. I've seen another piece that's out there where he has a mansion that's actually something worth over $10 billion. He's turned up in the Pandora Papers, and the Paradise Papers, and so lots of his mates who are oligarchs that have supported him. But in all of these things, which are all true, there's a series of things there that ring alarm bells. And one is, I was watching this thing and it was like a soccer team, and they were supporting their colours. Well, actually, they weren't even related to Ukraine, but they were supporting colours in support of peace in the Ukraine. Now, on the surface, you'd think, nothing wrong with that. Let's stop the war. That makes complete sense. But there's also another component for along this, which is like, donations, which I'll donate to the Ukrainian cause. Like, well, what's that money going to be actually spent for exactly? And, does anyone really understand the full complicated issues about why Putin has responded the way that he actually has responded? This stuff actually hasn't come out of the blue. And if you turn around and you look at Michael West, who's Professor Michael West from Sydney University Journalism, I think it's just over Sydney, he did a very good example in a piece on the Pandora boxes, Pandora Papers, which came up about, give or take, about 4 months beforehand. And he made the point saying all of these massive finds that we're finding, the money linked to Putin and all these other characters in Moldavia and so on. But what's missing from these groups is the KPMG and the PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Deloittes and all the company, all the kind of neoconservative elements that have been, and it sort of basically made the point saying, well, what this is really doing is it's selective targeting. It's targeting one set of audience, making them out to be the bad guys, which they are, but at the same time denying the fact that your audience, that there's another group of guys out there that are equally doing the same thing. And of course, when you look at the situation between Russia and the West, though, that's the same situation applies in terms of the arms race. The arms race hasn't just happened since the Ukraine. We've looked at New Zealand since 2017. These are stories that I've written about regularly. These are radio programs that I've projected saying, hey, look, we're looking at this huge military build-up in New Zealand, and it's not just happening in New Zealand, it's happening in Australia, throughout those Eastern European states, which has been one of the catalytic aspects of it. It's happening in Ukraine, Poland, Romania, Lithuania, and again, John Pelchin is the coming war of China, which was, this was made somewhere between 2000 and 2010, probably towards more the end of 2010, again, looking at this renewal of a Cold War, largely brought on by the fact that the West was waging all these wars in these areas and making a very good go at basically remaining as an imperial superpower in the coming 21st century. In fact, there's a project out there made up of very conservative gentlemen, of people that have supported the worst of the worst that the CIA has been involved in: Honduras, Nicaragua, Afghanistan, extremely right-wing people behind the whole Iran-Contra. And these have been people that have pushed for a Cold War during the entire 1980s and now are pushing for it now. And what's even more curious, what we don't really get is that when you look at sort of the instigations about where did perestroika go wrong, and for those who aren't aware, perestroika was the reform of Russia, marked a kind of the period of the First Cold War. And during one of these things that occurred was that all these Western groups went into Russia, including Stephen Jennings, the man that privatised rail and began the privatisation under Rogernomics in the 1980s. And I'll come back to Mr. Jennings because his links to Russia are very, very unreported in the New Zealand media. And Stephen Jennings, basically, he was the front person for the first experiment in privatisation within Russia, which was known as the Bolshevik Biscuit Company, BBC, if you will. And basically they went in there at the end of perestroika, where all these places have been, that had once belonged to the state, have been given to the people, shares, and there wasn't a lot of economy happening at that time, so money and cash flow was short. So the West would go in there and say, well, look, you've got a Bolshevik Biscuit company share worth $1,000, but I'll give you 100 crisp US dollars and a bottle of vodka, which was the sweetener in the deal. And they would turn around and take a company like the Bolshevik Biscuit Company that might say be worth, say, $10 million, and they would buy it for $1 million. And this became the model that the oligarchs that were supporting these very right-wing, neoconservative, just the worst of corporate America, yeehaw, we got the bomb, fuck you. And these guys, Putin turned around during what they call the October Revolution, and 91, 93, can't quite hold the date in my head, and basically Putin got on the back by getting rid of these guys and going out and saying, well, you actually haven't paid your taxes. You come in, you've got all the stuff for super cheap, and now you don't even want to pay your taxes, which goes back to that whole aspect of Michael West's situation being selectively. It's pointing out the Putin bad guys and all these Pandora Papers, but not pointing out the good old boys at the CIA and War Is Us and General American Yeehawness were ripping the countries off wholesale that they were going into, just like they'd done in in fact, just as they'd done in Chile in the 1970s, and just as they'd done during New Zealand without firing a shot during the privatisation process in the 1980s, which would be led by Stephen Jennings. Very interesting guy today in terms of, if you actually look at Renaissance Bank, and you look at a lot of people that were actually involved in Renaissance Banks and helping sell Yukos oil, and the whole handling of the money process, which has been spun around completely like, oh, evil Putin, he came around, he penalised us, but gone for a court case showing that, yes, you probably were teeth thieves, and here's another case for you. As was pointed out in the Privy Council ruling of South Canterbury Finance, set up by Humphrey Rollison, the CEO of the Christchurch Press, and obviously South Canterbury Finance, in conjunction with Alan Hubbard, the late Alan Hubbard, was that they were actually taken, and in the Privy Council ruling was like, yeah, well, okay, you're doing business with scumbags. That's what actually happens from scumbags. You go out there trying to get money from people because you're trying to make a deal and then you get burnt. Well, fool for you, lie down with dogs, get up with fleas. And so you have people like basically the claim that's been made in the West is like, oh, these are the evil people. Well, they were evil people, but you were quite happy to do business with them in the early days when you were making lots and lots of money. So these are some of the backdrop stories that our media just really doesn't cover. And it doesn't cover our involvement in it, and it doesn't look at all the shady Russian connections that I've found in New Zealand. That's starting with my first books, looking at Proc Bank and the Food for Oil program, and the using dodgy, shady banks in the Vanuatu to actually breach UN sanctions, which is kind of ironic because, again, if you actually look at what's happening, is that they're saying that there are sanctions, and yet they're using these banks so that there's still business going on. Like, you can buy oil, Americans are still buying Russian oil. The big companies, it's business as usual. It's only in these smaller companies that are being penalised, which hit the smaller people aren't really responsible for any of this. So, it reported on people like I think it's Lumanov, Alexander Kuzmanov worked for basically Mikhail Kumamich, who was one of the billionaires that turned up in New Zealand, but was working, another one of these strange Russians that you'll find working in high-level government departments. And he's not the only one. You look at, there's at least a couple of guys on my website, which you have to go to my website for the story today to link into that. But we've got a couple of guys working in the Treasury that, when you look at their backgrounds, they're from St. Petersburg, which is kind of where Renaissance Bank went in the 1990s. And you go, well, how come we've got all these Russians running around shaping policy? And I said, they're not Russians that are Vladimir Putin, they're not KGB people. Well, not the ones that work for the KGB, but they're the people that were actually got on board this whole privatisation process, which no one's really paying much attention to. So, for example, in the Ukraine, China turned around in 2014 and they bought up 800 square miles of land in the Ukraine. And this has pretty much also been happening with DuPont and Monsanto, huge American corporations, because it's not just the Chinese, but it's everyone just buying up whatever they can for cheap. And of course, in the eastern Ukraine, the part of the Ukraine which ethnically identifies with Russia, what they were finding was that they were being actually ethnically treated as a second-class, two-tiered citizen. At the same time, the nature of the state, so that the ability to get access to education, to health, all of that was being privatised and being cut off from the people in the eastern Ukraine, because all the resources were going to the central hubs, and leading to drop in quality of life. And the end result of that has been this brewing up of the separatism, which is with the Ukrainian government backed by Washington. And Washington, I say backed by Washington, I mean backed by the Donald Trumps, backed by the Joe Biden, so they're all as bad as each other. Backing these guys who were in turn financing right-wing separatists. We barely get a mention of any of that aspect of it. And of course that has a real relevance to New Zealand, because the person that went into the Christchurch shooting, Brenton Tarrant, he wore the battalion on dog tags and had on his pack and acknowledged he'd been to the Ukraine. So he was wearing them at the mission patch of the Azov, this far right-wing group that had basically started up the problems by their persecution of the east of the ethnic Russians in the Donbass region, or East Russia. Where again is our media reporting on that? Now, it doesn't, because at the end of the day, what's actually happened, this is how it works. Number one is our media has been immensely dumbed down in the last 25 years. This has come about from the processes of making more competitors available out there, even though we've got a set number of resources, therefore reducing the number of public funding available to make quality programs, changing the charter so they don't have to put our non-documentary or non-fiction stuff and material actually out there, an emphasis on marketing and advertising, so that programs, instead of being put on to educate us and enlighten us and understand the complexities of our world, are genuinely fit up for two reasons. Either they're fitting a particular narrative agenda, or they're cheap and nasty and they're fulfilling a commercial purpose. And again, at the same time that's gone on, we've seen turn around and seen things like that reduce the amount of funding to public media, things like Radio New Zealand, etc., have ended up with a media that is actually realises, the individual journalist realises that, they are in a precarious position. If they don't play along with the game, then basically they're actually looking at pretty much the dole line. And the same, we saw things during the COVID, for example, 450 journalists got laid off, 110 funding was provided for 110 journalists that would do stories that the government thought were of public interest. So the government was now deciding, and the government of course is also deciding who's accredited journalists, who can actually question them, who's not allowed to. And there's nobody out there in the media, in the mainstream channels, which are either reliant on public government funding or they're reliant on commercial funding, that's actually out there saying, well, no, we're going to hold our politicians to account. They can't just turn around and tell us who we can and who we can't talk to. So actually, Barry Soper's credit Radio New Zealand saying basically Trevor Muller during the protests, which went on for 25 days, of which 24 of them were actually quite peaceful, but for 24 of those days, Muller was saying that any journal media that's in the basically the Parliament environment that was found engaging the changing the protests would actually face consequences. Now that is pure censorship, and people say, oh yeah, but going back to the Ukraine situation, oh, imagine how terrible is Ukraine. Well, guys, again, this stuff doesn't start out of nowhere. It starts with somewhere, and one of those places which is what we're witnessing in New Zealand is that inability for a free press to actually challenge the status quo. You may remember, for example, that when John Campbell was laid off, having the highest rating program on New Zealand television, Campbell Live, it was done so because it basically led us from the corporate world saying, well, we don't like this guy because he keeps on picking on us. And that was the end of John Campbell, who went over to Radio New Zealand. And I don't think there's many people out there that turn around and say that, you know, he's become a bit of a bloody wimp, and he was the best that we had. So there's no one actually, I mean, to say there is no one out there is not correct. You have journalists like Andrea Vance, who's always written very sophisticated pieces, doesn't get messed around with easily, and, you know, she is a force to be reckoned with. There's David Fisher, there's Nikki Hager. So we do have, individually still have good journalists, but unfortunately, even when I was speaking to Nikki Hager up in Wellington, he says, look, you know, people will publish my stuff because I'm internationally known, but they don't seek me out because my work is controversial. And there's something wrong with the media, which is entire purpose is to get to the deep bottom of the issues, that has that particular cultural environment. And, you know, for journalists saying, you know, who nonsense out and say, oh, journalists aren't influenced by this. Well, I've literally sat in pubs where high-level, high-ranking journalists buy me drinks, have turned around and said, God, fuck, you're good at what you do. And I've said, well, look, you know, you're literally smarter than me, you're more qualified than me, you work for an organisation with better resources than me. Why aren't you doing the stories that I'd love to be able to do with the resources you're doing? Only to be told, as the guy's waving his Visa card, oh, if I did that, I wouldn't have this job. And that's a self-acknowledgement of the self-censorship at work here within our media as well. So instead, what we also gain, another one of these changes occurred during this privatisation period of the 1990s or 80s, 90s in New Zealand, which is now sort of, we're going for another phase and we're about to go through something. And I don't think the average Kiwi really understands, but and I'll come back to that point in a second too. But we have this media that's just become less and less sophisticated. So part of that culture was this new situation where they'd bring in things like Project and the Story, where comedians, not journalists, not intellectual thinking people, not people who actually are relatively well read and actually have a pretty good grasp on the world affairs, would be hosting news shows, and the news shows would be made into big comedies, so that they would actually, people start to have little Now, not only is that really insidious, because that's actually like peer pressure on the school ground, kind of telling people about what to think, and that's the difference. Our previous reporters would read you the news and let you do the thing. These guys are now guiding you, little marketing, it's a little psychological prompt, and part of that whole peer pressure which you experience when we're at the school grounds, and they behave like kids at the school ground. They tell these simpering jokes. It's all about reinforcement and peer pressure, and at the end of the result, no one's actually saying, how appropriate is it to actually have people laughing at these issues? People watch the news because there are serious things going on, and they deserve to be treated in a serious entertainment, a serious manner, as opposed to entertainment. But yet, that's where we've come to actually view our media. And so again, we've got things like Halle Berry and Newsboy, and they make these little simmering comments about what deodorant they use in the shower, and, you know, and they put, again, their personal opinion. And to be quite frank, okay, I know 90% of you guys turn around and say, yeah, I've signed the vaccination, and that's cool. But when you actually have somebody on television turning around and saying, I wouldn't even let unvaccinated people into my property in a pub tent, which is what Halle Berry said, you know what, that's actually pretty bigoted. And we talk all about these hate speeches and, you know, the ability. Here is a person right there on television basically saying it's okay to actually smear and look your nose down at another Kiwi. And that's where we're at in our mindset. We think that that's actually morally acceptable for a broadcaster to actually behave that way. Well, I don't. And again, I went up and I covered the protests in Wellington to see what actually occurred. I wanted to see the disconnect. And yes, I've had my niece on the show, Ruby. If I didn't say it loud, she sure still did turn around saying there were people in the protest belief and protest movement that believe some pretty, out there ideas, and they weren't really based in, from my viewpoint as a professional researcher, in any real reality. They were based on what they wanted things to be. And yet, that was tended to be more the case of that was the people that the media always focus on when there were plenty of other people to talk at the protests, which they chose not to do. But that's not really my point. My point is sort of thinking about watching them. You could always measure the level of how much shit the protesters were going to get that day by the number of cameras that would turn up on the old parliamentary buildings, and they'll be lined up. There's like a little fort looking down onto the peasants, and they would line up there. And, there was 4 cameras, and you were really going to get a fucking pasting that day. And then there's one, it was like, oh, there's some little piece, someone's going to do some piece, and nothing not to worry about. But the thing was that they'd set these cameras up, and they'd walk away. And the point was that they weren't there to film the story. The cameras had just been turned on, and then they would edit afterwards from that footage. They'd walk away from the camera and edit the footage to fit the story they wanted to tell. And literally, again, I've walked around protests in New Zealand, and I'm not just, please don't think I'm just the anti-mandate. I was also at the Trans-Pacific Partnership protests, and again, journalists turn up, and they actually turn around, and they have their notebooks in their hands, and they're closed, which to me is a sign that they've already been told what story to write. And that's the mindset where we're at with our press. And unfortunately, it's a really scary thing, because, we rely on our media to actually be able to call our politicians to task. And if they're not willing to do that, then who are we left with? And it turns out in this environment, you're only allowed to listen to the one true source of information. And that one true source of information is really not that really good at being held accountable, nor is there much awareness going on in terms of when you have and John Key did the same thing. So again, please understand, I'm trying to spread this from a partisan viewpoint. I'm not picking on the Jacinda Ardern, but the situation which has crept into our media, where journalists, the politicians, the prime ministers, can arrange to do press releases where they decide who will actually get to be there and who won't get to be there. They then get to choose whose questions they'll be actually answering. And of course, Toba O'Brien's become so common that she's so friendly that it's become, the backbone of several comedy skits. And then in that environment, which is controlled for camera angles and so on, there is no real chance to actually ask our leaders hard questions. And again, there's that situation of, if you don't play ball, you won't be allowed into that room, and then therefore your status will be, marginalised. You won't get access to the big stories and get your headlines in the newspapers on the front line pages and at the 6 o'clock news. And it's finally frustrating for me, is this aspect that our media has come along and creates the format where everything must be black or white, and there are no hues or rooms for discussion for alternative agendas or other particular perspective. So whether it's Ukraine, the idea is, of course, that if you oppose Putin, then you're some kind of right-wing alt conspiracy theorist. And again, it's like, that's the throwaway line, but it doesn't even make sense when you're looking at the Azov, which are a far-right brigade working actually in the Ukraine, and have been working this since 2008, and are now getting mainstream media like Qatar, who signed up and made multiple deals with the West in concerns of things like Afghanistan, access to space technology, access to Starlink technology. Qatar is very much part of that cartel that's very much promoting Western progressive within the Middle East. But there they are doing stories on the other day on Al Jazeera, so saying, the Azov, they're not that right-wing, saying, only 10% were Nazis. Stop. One person turns up at the protests in Wellington that has far-right connections. Suddenly everybody in the parliament protests as a far-right protester. And yet you can have literally battalions of people carrying out death squads in the Ukraine. Oh, no, only 10% of them. The double standard at work here is incredible, and it goes to the same situation when we turn around during the Christchurch shooting. Jacinda Ardern plays the John Key, the cult of personality, media controlled. No one's actually asking them difficult questions, so they get to be the great leader because, of course, no one's actually asking them those tricky questions, such as, "Gee, why did you guys not do anything about it?" It wasn't like there was a warning at Otago University that there was going to be a mass shooting in 2015 and a whole background of background information that led you to a shooter. Oh, actually, that's right, there was. But we won't ask you that questions, and then we'll let you have this idea, she did such a great job during the shooting. Well, she wore a hijab and did a few selfies. And it said, did the same thing like John Key did during the RV arena where he went off to watch football. Not exactly what I call great leadership, but and then to top it off, she turns around and they're going to make up this movie called They Are Us. The CGI company making the film is Framestore, which is the company that Jacinda Ardern worked for when she was a public relations spin doctor for Tony Blair at the time, when Tony Blair was telling us that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And that was a story that was peddled by all the television networks whose representatives are part of what they call the Council of Foreign Relations. Council of Foreign Relations, big political action network group in the United States, made up of all the people who went to the Harvard and all the old schools and all the old school families, and then you get invited if you're very prestigious. And the purpose of the Council of Foreign Relations is to make sure that all American media end up selling the same story. So, you know, during the elections, it'd be like Fox against Donald Trump, for Donald Trump, CNN's against Donald Trump, and yet both those networks at the end of the day are both agree on one thing, but they always report America yeehaw when it comes to a war. That's the one thing they agree on. COVID, they pick a particular narrative fitting the pharmaceutical broadcasting companies to assume that we should only have one particular response to the COVID and not look at a particular other responses, such as was done in Japan, where they had a multiple vaccine approach, plus they had a non-vaccine treatment program as well. That Council of Foreign Relations media in turn will then turn around, because it is such a powerful pact, will in turn be followed by the journalists that belong to the main groups on the BBC, the Al Jazeera, the overall Western-based media, so they all fall in line and start telling the same story. Now, here we are, having gone through the Gulf War, which said the story which was sold by public relations spin and by people like Jacinda Ardern, and we're going through another situation in Ukraine, and we're listening to the same people, and nobody's saying, wait a minute, hey, these people weren't particularly honest, and they use some pretty seedy public politics and public relationship strips. Why should we believe them now? And we should believe them, because, you know, in those times we've seen from Blair get supported by companies, public relations companies like Textor and Crosby, the background of satire for like Alan Bastard, the great statesman. These things were then, of course, these methodologies were replicated in terms of you had John Key again supported by Crosby and Textor, and financed by Mr. Stephen Jennings, by the way, the man that actually went in and basically helped privatise Russia, as did many of our Treasury people who went throughout Eastern Europe and South America leading these same ideas, which had actually been carried out in Chile 10 years beforehand, but with a military coup. This way it was done by control of the media. And they've done the same situation here. So that with our end result today is that we now live in a world pre-COVID where there were 10 public relations journalists for every one journalist that was actually working as a journalist. Today, we're living in a world where there are 20 journalists for every 20 public relations experts for every journalist. Plus, we're running in a world where the tech companies control the algorithms of the social media, so they can run information dominance, which is the ability to control what you're seeing on your feeds. They've got fact checkers out there that frankly don't seem to be more about opinionated checkers, who will ping you for the most spurious things and actually severely impact, you know, as me as a journalist, my ability to reach people. Example, I turned around before the Ukraine war broke out. I demonstrated a picture of Azov battalion people from Ukraine holding up the manifesto of the Christchurch shooter. That got me blocked on Facebook for 7 days, and now my restrictions won't show up for 90 days and I can't do live feeds. For simply, and my source was reporting Bellingcat, which is an exceptionally well recognised source related to security issues, which is utilised by mainstream media all around the world. And yet, because somebody has a fit narrative, suddenly that's it. I lose my algorithm control, which promotes my websites and my own technical platforms, because that's the world we actually live in at the same time. At the same time, we're looking at New Zealand. We're about to watch hate laws get passed through where you don't even have to, you get no defence. They just, that person said something horrible, ping, you get an instant actual fine. At the same time, our media is now going to be amalgamated by Chris Whawhau, that's bringing in this ridiculous legislation. He's amalgamating TVNZ to Radio New Zealand to become one thing, which, as I explained beforehand, that never is a good thing for public television, and making sure that you've got integral sources that are going to challenge the government. Not when they're actually going, well, actually, there's less and less of us, and if we don't do what we're told, we're going to lose our jobs. So that's where we are today, boys and girls. I'm going to carry on my little walk now from Nelson. I would like you to just take the point of the story today that it's not about, I want people to look at stories not for agree or against them, but be able to pick them up and look at them in a holistic method, viewpoint, which our current media won't allow you to do. You must be either for us or against us. So I'll leave you on that. Fresh FM, the Deadline Report with Ben Vidgen, and let's go out with I Didn't Start the Fire by Billy Joel, my secret guilty pleasure.